Hey guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. Today is going to be the start of our college football rankings. So each week we're going to come in here with our top 25 rankings. They'll probably be different from the AP and the coaches poll and the ESPN. These are just our rankings. So this first episode, we're going to go from 25 to 1 and talk about kind of an overview on some of these teams, how we think we're going to do during the season. So this episode might be longer than some in the future. In the future, we'll kind of breeze through it a little more, talk about how the teams have played, if they're going up or down. And with that being said, we can just start. Both of us have I wouldn't say very different lists, but similar teams, maybe in different spots. So starting with 25, in my 25th spot going into the season, I have Texas Tech.
Yeah, and so do I. Texas Tech, I mean, a lot of people, you look at the coaches poll, they're a team that's ranked. You look in the AP poll, it's a team that's not. There's definitely some mixed opinions on them. For me, it's a team competing in the Big 12, and they have 17 returning starters. Really not too much more than that. They were solid last year. I think they take a jump this year. I think 25 is a fair spot for them.
Yeah, and like you said, they're in the coaches poll, but not in the AP poll. Looking at both of those, usually I take more away from the coaches poll just because I feel like they have a better sense than the AP most of the time. But with that being said, moving on to 24, I have Tulane, and Tulane is in for, a good year for how good the team is. They're going to end up playing South Alabama in the first week, so that'll be a big test for Michael Pratt, their quarterback. So as long as they can play well and get through this week one, I think they'll have a decent year. They can definitely end up as a ranked team by the end of the year. Nothing too hard. Obviously games against Ole Miss, that might be a tough matchup for them. But outside of that, teams like Florida Atlantic, you have teams like Tulsa, ECU, Rice, they should be in for a good year.
Yeah. And at 24, I have a team you mentioned. I have Ole Miss. Obviously, they do have the game against Tulane, and they're on an SEC schedule, so things are going to be tough for them. Ole Miss has kind of been in a weird spot. I feel like at the quarterback position ever since Matt Corral left. But Jackson Dart, he has a lot of juice behind him. I think a lot of people are really invested on what he's going to do for this Rebels team. So if he pushes that team to a top 25 spot, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I do anticipate that, having them at 24.
And next up in the 23 spot, I have Texas A&M. And this is an interesting team because they've been a lot better in years past. And I'm not saying they're a bad team now. It just seems like, especially with all these teams in the SEC getting so many great recruits, it seems like Texas A&M is starting to fall off a little bit. And with Texas coming into the SEC soon and Texas already getting most of the higher up recruits, it might be a tough time for Texas A&M, but they do have a young quarterback in Connor Wegman who is projected to be a very good quarterback this year. I know there's a lot of hype coming out of the Texas A&M area, and there's a lot of people that have a high belief in him. And I'd like to see how he plays this season. Last year, he had a decent season overall. He only played in 5 games, but in those 5 games, 900 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 132 passer rating. So it'll be interesting to see how he plays this year against the SEC competition.
Yeah. And at 23, I have Tulane. Tulane, you mentioned them earlier. Their schedule is not the hardest. They're a team that, in recent years feels like has dominated the competition a little bit. And I'm really interested to see what their running back room looks like. Tyjae Spears is obviously in the NFL now. He was one of my favorite running backs in the country last year. And it seems like they know how to develop running backs over there in Tulane. I think that's going to be another, dominant aspect of their offense. I really hope it is. And if that's the case, Tulane is just too solid of a squad playing against too weak of competition to not be in this conversation right now.
Yeah. Next up at 22, I have a team that you mentioned before, Ole Miss. I'm a little higher on Ole Miss. This team, captained by Jackson Dart. I have been a fan of Jackson Dart before the train even left the station. I remember watching him in high school. He had a game on ESPN his junior year, I believe, and I watched him and I thought he was a great quarterback. And since then at Ole Miss, he had a decent year last year, but I'm expecting a lot bigger and better year this year. Being in the SEC, it's obviously never easy, but they do have some decent players, especially on that defense, on the edge, and in that cornerback and safety room. And I think Jackson Dart will be in for a good year this year.
Yeah. And, I think you put it perfectly. He's a guy that was supposed to be at this high level last year, wasn't quite there. And then he beat the quarterback competition that they brought in this year. So hopefully we're looking at a good season for Dart. At 22, I have Texas A&M. Obviously, you mentioned them earlier. I'm just one spot higher on them. It is a lot of competition again in the SEC. You know, everything is real, everything's bigger down there. But Texas A&M does have, you know, those older recruits that they brought in. So even though they've fallen off the recruiting train recently, now these guys that they brought in a couple years ago, when it seems like they were at the top of recruitment, you know, they're juniors, they're seniors, and I expect them to come up and have a big season. It's not going to be easy. There's definitely a world where Texas A&M falls off a little bit, especially towards, you know, that middle end of the season when they're playing against, you know, some of these teams that might be ranked in the top 15 around then. But at the end of the day, there's too much talent on the team for me to not give them a spot here. And more than likely, they're going to be a team that finishes with a pretty solid record.
And then next up, at 21, for the 21 and 20 spot, we both have the same teams. We're just flip-flopped. At 21, I have UNC, and this is going to be a big year for them. They've been in the rankings the past few years, but obviously with a guy like Drake May, who's projected to be a top 5, even a top 3 pick potentially, if he goes out there and balls, they are going to have a great year. They do have some great players. They did lose Josh Downs, obviously, on the offense, but they are getting Devontae Walker, who I think is going to be a great addition for this team overall. And I mean, they have a good defense too, but when you have a quarterback that high caliber and high profile as Drake May, it is going to fall on him whether this defense is bad or not. He is going to be the guy that everyone is looking at. Drake May is going to have all the lights on him. And if he wants to beat out Caleb Williams, I know everyone's very high on Caleb Williams, but like we said, we never know what's going to happen with these quarterbacks. I still do think Caleb Williams is the best in this class, but there are some people that have Drake May up there and after Caleb Williams too. Drake May's in that conversation of who could be the second quarterback overall. There's a lot of guys vying for that position with Quinn Ewers, even guys that we've seen like Bo Nix, who people are talking about too. Someone needs to get drafted second at quarterback, Michael Penix. So it just depends on who's going to put themselves up there, and Drake May could do that this season.
Yeah, and for those reasons, I have UNC 20. I think you covered all my points here, so I'll just talk about Wisconsin for a little bit. You have them at 20, I have them at 21. Wisconsin's kind of been in a weird sort of position like teams like Iowa are in where, you know, they have an offense, but is it as high powered as they want it to be? Can they actually convert? Is it an offense that takes you the distance? And it feels like for the Badgers, ever since Jonathan Taylor was drafted, that running back room has been, you know, kind of an issue. And that was solved in recent years with Graham Mertz. And say what you will about him, but he was a guy that led that offense and allowed them to be more pass heavy. With him gone to Florida this year, they're really looking like they're going to go back into the direction of feeding the running back. And that's a dangerous game. It's not always something that's going to work out. But if their running backs can fire and be more explosive than they have been in the last couple of years, where their yards per carry numbers have been kind of horrible, then this Wisconsin team is going to be really good. We know their defense is solid. They always put a lot of energy into that side of the ball. But if they can just run the ball successfully at a high clip, and just get yards at the end of the day. If you get yards, you're going to score. It's not always about the big play. If they just have the offensive line work as a cohesive unit, move down the field, this Wisconsin team is going to be good. We see it every year. Just they can't fall off towards the end of the season like they have in recent years. That's going to be a big part of this Badgers team.
Yeah, and like you said, overall, Braylon Allen, who's going to be their starting running back here, he's projected towards a second round pick, and I do think that he could definitely move up the rankings too. But if a team is going to go all in on that running back area, the best division to be in is the Big Ten. So that's why I'm giving Wisconsin a little bit of a nod here. And then moving past that, at 19, I have Oregon State, and they have a quarterback coming in here this year in DJ Ungalilea, who I have never really been a huge fan of. I know when he was there at Clemson his freshman year, everyone was excited about him. There were a lot of people saying he was going to be up there with Trevor Lawrence. He was going to get drafted very high. And he just didn't pan out at all. And now he's going over to Oregon State. And this team ranked within the top 20 to start the season. I'm not exactly sure how well they're going to do with him. I think it will be better for him to be on a team with less expectations, obviously, as he had at Clemson, being the heir to Trevor Lawrence. So he could come out and play decent football and keep this team afloat within the rankings, end up as a top 25 team towards the end of the year. But I do think Oregon State, besides that, is a decent team, and that 20-ish ranking area, I think, is fair for them.
Yeah, and at 19, I have Oklahoma. The story of Oklahoma's season is going to be that game against Texas that's taking place in Dallas. At that point, they're going to be 5 games in. Oklahoma has a real chance to go into that game undefeated, but as we'll talk about later, Texas, maybe they're back. They're a team that has high expectations every year, and just on paper, they're a studded cast over there. So Oklahoma's going to have big expectations going into that game, and it's not going to be easy. I'm not sure if I'm completely bought in on Dylan Gabriel. I know a lot of people are more than I am. I'm still kind of waiting to see it. I know we found success at UCF, but it's a whole different story when you're playing for Oklahoma. They're especially the Sooners have been a team that's kind of been disappointing over the last couple of years. Obviously, had some big losses in some spots that you don't want to. So they're a team that's going to be up and down every year. I don't know. It's a tough spot. I think 19 is a fair spot for them. I can see if someone has them a lot higher or a lot lower. But if Dylan Gabriel and that offense can put all the pieces together, get a win in Texas, in Dallas, then the rest of the season might be a breeze because that's going to be their biggest task. And I'm looking forward to that game.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I had Oklahoma at my 18 spot, and we kind of had them in Oregon State flip-flop like we did before. Going into the 17 spot, I have Kansas State. I think they're going to be decent this year. Overall, they don't have too many pieces that really excite me. They have some decent players overall, and that's kind of why I have them in this area. I mean, their best overall player, I would say, is probably on their offensive line with Cooper Bebe, who is going to be a great offensive tackle and probably get drafted within the first 2 rounds of this year. But when we highlight a team and say their offensive tackle is usually the best player, sometimes it doesn't make as an exciting team overall. But this team's going to be decent, and I think they'll be within the top 20. I have them at 17 right now.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Just at 18, I had Oregon State. You already covered them. 17, I also have Kansas State. Just looking at their schedule, I think you covered a lot of what I had to say about their offense. So I'll kick it over to the schedule again. They have some tough games after their week off. So if Kansas State can get off to a strong start to their season, I think they're a team that can, realistically compete towards the higher level of this top 25. But if they don't come out firing, then that end of the season might just beat them up, and they might not be a team that's ranked. With that being said, solid squad. I think 17 is very fair, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and another team kind of falling in that same area is TCU. I have them ranked at 16 right now, and obviously they're coming off of a great season last year. But with that great season, a lot of their best players did leave the team, whether that was to get drafted or whatever they did after that. But I do think they're in like Kansas State for another decent overall season, and it's not going to be too hard for them. I mean, starting off this season, they're going to be playing against Colorado, which is a game where a lot of people are going to be tuned into. A lot of people want to see how good Colorado is. But if they go into that game and beat Colorado by a lot, like they're projected to do, I don't think they have too much of a struggle until the end of the season. Obviously, when they start to pick up against Kansas State, against Texas Tech, against Texas, against Oklahoma. So that will be a big test for them. But if they can come out of that, maybe winning 2 out of those 4 games against Kansas State, Texas, Oklahoma, and Texas Tech, they're going to end up within that top 20 area again.
Yeah, for sure. And I also have them at 16. As you mentioned, the magical season last year, a lot of guys are moved on to different aspects of the game. A lot of guys got drafted, a lot of guys transferred, but a guy that transferred in was Trey Sanders, and he's a really good running back, obviously coming from Alabama. And, they're moving on for Max Duggan, maybe with a running back like Sanders that they're comfortable with. They look a little more run heavy this year. Either way, that TCU team is really solid. I love what they're doing on the defensive side. So I think the Horned Frogs will have another pretty solid season this year.
Yeah, and next up, we both have the same team for our 15th overall ranked team. And my one note that I have for Oregon is Bo Nix. Bo Nix, every single season, has come into the year, and he has been good against every team that is not named Georgia. So it just depends. They're not going to be playing Georgia this year, so they should be able to go out there and have a good year. I have never really been a big fan of Bo Nix overall. I don't think he's that great of a quarterback, and he's falling into that same trap that I had with Will Levis last year, where a lot of people were very high on him. And despite that, I just don't really see exactly what's great about him. But I'll let you talk more about Oregon too with Bo Nix.
Yeah, and I mean, Bo Nix is the obvious guy to point out here. I knew you would mention him. So I do want to talk about Oregon's defensive side of the ball, which is kind of what I'm bought in on this year. Pac-12 play might not be nice to the Ducks. I know the Pac-12 is ceasing to exist pretty soon, but they still got one more year of it. but I just love the way their defense runs. I think we saw your guy, Kayvon Thibodeau, be a prime example of that. Obviously, Thibodeau was a freak player. He would have succeeded anywhere, but he really showed off in that Oregon system. And I think the guys on the edge for Oregon this year will show up as well. If any team is going to shut down guys like Caleb Williams and Michael Penix, it would be the Ducks. I'm going to struggle with that name when we talk about Washington too, but I like what their defense is doing. Obviously, if Bo Nix plays at a high caliber, the offense is going to run well too. And I think that's why a lot of people are bought in on the Ducks this year. It's obviously a lot that goes into a long season, especially when you have to play against Heisman caliber players. It feels like every week towards the end of the season, but I kind of like what the Ducks are doing. I might be a little higher on them as we move forward.
Yeah, I think they'll have a good season overall. But like we said, it's just going to fall back onto Bo Nix. And another team kind of with the same area where it's going to fall on their quarterback is Utah. And as we're recording this, they just took down Florida the other night. And that was without Cameron Rising in the backfield. We're not exactly sure when he's going to come back off of that injury, but they looked very good without him. And they're got most of their squad together. I mean, they did have a few players last year that left, but they're looking to go for that three-peat within the division. And I think they're going to be in for a great year too. And having them at 14, I think with Cameron Rising, if he can come back healthy, especially when they start to play in conference games, I don't see why they wouldn't come back and kind of I mean, I don't know exactly if they'll get the three-peat this year, just because I'm a little higher on USC. But like we saw last year, Utah does have their number, so I wouldn't be surprised if those games are very close.
Yeah. And just more about the game last night. Obviously, Rising being out was a big difference maker. They still showed up. They were missing 8 starters last night, and they still handled business. I don't think they looked great last night. Obviously, they were kind of slow on the offensive side of the ball. They weren't really moving as well as you would hope. But with that being said, they showed a lot of resilience. And, putting them in the top 15 is, it's a big compliment. Not everybody gets to say that they made the top 15 on anyone's list. But a team that shows resilience like that and beats a team like Florida, who, sneakily knocks off a lot of the top competitors year after year, it's enough for me to be confident with them at that 14 spot. And, hopefully, if the season goes well, that USC game is one of the best games we're going to see all year.
Next up at 13, I have Notre Dame. I'm a little lower on them than I know you are, but Sam Hartman is going to be the main reason why this team will succeed or fail. They have a lot of tests this season with Ohio State, Clemson, and USC, which will really show us if they're a contender or a pretender. Every year we see them play this ACC modified schedule since they're not really in a division, and then they end up making the playoffs, and then they end up getting smoked. But with Sam Hartman coming in there, I do like Sam Hartman, but like I said, I think it will fall on him. He will be the main reason why I think this team will succeed or fail. I do think the defense is good, but at the quarterback position, he's going to be the guy that has a lot of eyes on him. And with Ohio State, Clemson, and USC, those are all big games. So if they can come out here and maybe not win all of those games, if they do win them all, I mean, then they're obviously looking for a playoff spot. But if they can come out and be competitive in all those games, I will probably be a little higher on them as we go throughout the season.
Yeah, and that 13, I have a squad I'm a little lower on than most have Florida State. We know the team has firepower on offense. They have, a great passing game that they built up throughout the years, but I'm just not bought in on their defense, if I can be honest, especially their pass defense. In the last couple of years, that's been an issue that they've been looking to address. Obviously, they thought they had it with Travis Hunter. He never actually was able to play for the team, Jackson State, now Colorado. So that was a big loss. Obviously, you get the number one corner in the country. You think you're going to address that pass defense, and then it just doesn't work out that way. And I feel like they've been scrambling for answers ever since then. I don't think it's addressed at all. So I'm not saying they're going to be bad by any means. 13 is really good. But if they have a pass defense that I'm not comfortable with, that's going to be a really big problem once you get into conference play and you have some of these, top level quarterbacks trying to piece up your defense. It's just an issue that I think they'll address more going forward. I just don't think they have it this season. So I don't expect them to be a top 10 team like some other people do.
Yeah. And next up, I have Tennessee at 12. And I'll keep mine a little short because I want to let you talk a little more about Tennessee. But some questions that I have with their team overall, obviously, how will Joe Milton do this year? They do have some great players on offense with their tight end, with McCallahan, Class, Castles, and Brew McCoy, too, at wide receiver. And I mean, the offensive line, too, is great. Obviously, they're losing Darnell Wright, but I think we could see another scenario like we saw last year. Joe Milton could come in here and play very well, like they did last year with their quarterback system. And I think they'll be a good team overall, but I do want to leave them a little farther off at 12. And if they come out and impress me and Joe Milton comes out and plays very well, I do think they'll definitely be able to move up a lot. But I just want to be a little fair with them with some other teams that have a little more proven quarterbacks and overall teams.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. At 12, I have Texas. Obviously, the question is if they're really back. And I think a big story of their season is going to be what happened in the transfer portal this offseason. Getting Mitchell from Georgia really improves the receiver room. And with a guy you mentioned earlier that you'll talk about more later, Quinn Ewers, you really want to get as many pieces around him as possible. We know he's a solid quarterback, but still, he needs guys around him. He's not the perfect prospect or anything. So getting a guy like Mitchell is going to be huge for their receiver room. But losing Ove Agafo to LSU is going to be an issue. He's a really good edge rusher last year. I think he had one of the more underrated seasons of college football. LSU's happy to have him. He's going to be great for their front seven, but it's going to be another issue for Texas's defense. Talked a lot about these defensives lately. Obviously, when people talk college football, they want to talk offense, they want to talk quarterbacks, but a lot of the time we see teams, hit that wall towards the middle or the end of their season is because they're letting up too many points. And I'm kind of scared that Texas is going to be one of those teams down the stretch if they can't figure it out in that front seven.
Yeah. Next up, we have Washington. I have them at the 11th spot. And Michael Penix Jr., like I talked about a little bit before, he's one of my dark horse picks for Heisman. He's kind of in that plus 1,400 area right now. And he has Rome Aduzin, and he also has Jalen McMillan to help him out. This team, I think overall is in for a good year. I really believe in Michael Penix overall. I think like I said, I think he's going to have a big year this year, and he could go out there and potentially get that second overall quarterback spot like I was talking about earlier. I'm not huge on Drake May. I do think right now he's probably the second best quarterback in this class, but like we know with college football, if you go out and have a fantastic year this year, especially in the position that Michael Penix is in, he could go up there and be that second quarterback drafted in this season. And this team overall has been built well around him, like I said before, with the offense and the defense. And Washington, obviously, they're not going to have too hard of a schedule. They will have to play some decent teams throughout the year, but I do see them coming out on top. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're in that top 10 by the end of the season. I have them right on the edge at 11 right now.
Yeah. And at 11, I won't go on too long. I have Notre Dame. You talked about him a little bit earlier. I'm pretty confident that Hartman will find success. I mean, he's an older guy, but let's talk about a guy that might be the second best QB in this class. I think he's definitely vying for that position. As a prospect, who knows? But as a college football player, we know he's solid. He's shown off for years on years now. So I'm confident he's going to succeed. I'm more worried about the coaching. Marcus Freeman, obviously, very disappointing last year. Is he going to open up enough holes on the offense to create a dynamic running game to go along with Hartman? That's the biggest question for me with Notre Dame. I think they're going to be really good. Obviously, looked good against Air Force. Wasn't really a fair competition, but I think the Fighting Irish are in for a good season.
Yeah. Next up, I have Texas at 10. And historically, I have always clowned on all these places for putting Texas this high up, just because I never felt like they were back. As every year, it seemed like people were talking about that. But this is finally the year that I'm buying in on Texas. They have Quinn Ewers. They have Xavier Worthy. They have A.D. Mitchell, who they just got. They have Jatavion Sanders. And those four guys together is going to make one of the best offenses and the most exciting to watch in college football this year. I mean, Xavier Worthy, who I released my top 25 rankings for, they've definitely changed a lot. But when I released them earlier in this summer, he was up there. I mean, I think he's going to be one of the best players at that wide receiver position going into this season. Obviously, he's going to be competing with the guys, both of them from Ohio State, that we'll see. I don't think he's as good as Marvin Harrison, but he could fight with Egbuka up there. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Xavier Worthy is the second wide receiver drafted in this class. I know he's a little smaller, but he is very fast, and this will help Quinn Ewers out. He was drafted or touted as the number one overall quarterback in his class, and we haven't really seen him play to the level that we're expected to. But last year, they almost knocked off Alabama before that injury happened. And I think with a full healthy season, this team is going to be very hard to stop, especially on offense. And if they can fire on all cylinders, that group of wide receivers and tight ends with Quinn Ewers is going to be very exciting to watch.
Yeah, and I completely understand that as well. At 10, I have Washington, who we talked a little bit about earlier. If Penix Jr. is really the Heisman candidate that I know you think, that a lot of other people in the media think he can be, then this Washington team is going to be tough to stop. We've seen them find success in years prior. It's just a good squad they built around him. I think you covered a lot of my main points, but it's an exciting offense. If Penix is as real as we have seen him be in his college football careers up to this point, then I think the Huskies are going to be competing for, a playoff spot if they get everything right towards the end of the season.
Next up at number 9, I have Clemson, and this Clemson defense is the reason why the team will stay afloat throughout the year. I think they might have a shaky offense, but with Barrett Carter and Jeremiah Trotter as linebackers, probably the best linebacker duo in the country right now. Both of those guys I fully expected to get drafted within the first round this year. And on the defensive side, too, that cornerback and safety area, too, is just amazing this season. And that defense is going to keep them up there. But the one question mark is Cade Klubnik. We're not really sure exactly how great he's going to be this season. And I think that's kind of where my questions lie. If he can go out there and play well to decent, I think they could be a lot higher and they could fight for a potential playoff spot towards the end of the year. But I think 9 right now, which is obviously very good. There can only be 10 teams within the top 10, and Clemson is one of them. But that defense is going to keep them up there. So it just depends on how good this offense is going to be. But even if the offense is mediocre, this defense will carry them. And I still think they'll be a top 10 team by the end of the year.
Yeah. And at 9, I have Tennessee. I know some people may think I'm showing a little bit of bias here, but let's not forget Tennessee was a playoff team last year until a horrible end to the season. They were competing for the entire year, and they really haven't lost as much as you may think. They have a lot of returning guys. Obviously, Darnell Wright got drafted, but that offensive line stays pretty similar. And obviously, moving on from Hendon Hooker will be a hit, but Joe Milton is going to be an incredible SEC quarterback, and I truly believe that. We saw it in the bowl game last year, and we saw it when he came to Tennessee. When he came to Tennessee, he looked flustered. He wasn't the starter. He just didn't have it in him, and he got benched for Hendon Hooker. And instead of transferring out like a lot of dudes, decide to do it in this era of college football where the transfer portal becomes so flooded, he decided to stick as the backup, learn from his mistakes, and stay involved in the Tennessee system. Where when he came back and showed out for a couple of the last games of the season, he really looked like an SEC starting caliber quarterback. And outside of the passing game, I know a lot of people are going to talk about Joe Milton. I think the running game is much improved. I'm excited to see Jabari Small come back. I think he's a really good running back. And Jalen Wright and Small create a really good duo in the backfield. The defense is what it is. It has its flashes. It has its moments where it doesn't look so great. But with an incredible offense like that Josh Heupel has put together, Tennessee is a team that could realistically put it 50 to 60 on almost any team in the country. And you just can't say that about most teams on this list. So I have them at 9. It's a little higher than most, but I really think that, towards the end of the season, they might finish there or even higher.
In my 8th spot, I have Florida State, and probably the biggest discrepancy between both of our lists to start the season. I have them at 8, and I believe you had them at 13. My belief in Florida State this year, Jordan Travis, I mean, he's coming into this season. He's looking to make a statement, and he has a talented receiving room with Jaheim Bell and Johnny Wilson. And both of those guys, I think, will probably get drafted high within this year. But the defense is really what's turning heads for me. The defensive line and edge rushers are probably one of the best groups in the country this year. Jared Verse is the head of the table of that team, and he is one of the best players in college football this year. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets up there and is probably the first non-quarterback drafted in this class overall. Jared Verse is absolutely insane, and he's going to be up there with Dallas Turner. Both of these guys are going to be vying for that top position for edge rusher. I do think Caleb Williams obviously will probably get drafted first overall. Then we might see Drake May. But besides that, we could be in for a scenario like last year where we saw a quarterback get drafted, even though I still believe Will Anderson was the best player in that draft. I think Jared Verse is up there, and he is going to be great for this team. I'm very high on Florida State this year, and I think with Jordan Travis, this offense and this defense, they're in for a big year.
Yeah. And at 8, I have Penn State. Obviously, I'm going to let you talk a little more about Penn State, but they're out of the Sean Clifford era. And, they still have some of the same big names that they had last year to surround that offense. Obviously, Nick Singleton, he's an incredible back. And in that backfield, combined with a guy like Allen, who's going to be a redshirt freshman this year, it should be special. The O line looks better than ever. And if Penn State can get on a roll, we know they can be dangerous. Obviously, they're going to have some tough tasks ahead of them. The Big Ten is not as easy as some people make it out to be, especially with Penn State having to rival teams like, Michigan, Ohio State. It's going to be a fun season for the Nittany Lions, and I'm going to let you talk a little more about them, but I think 8 is a very fair placement for them.
Yeah, and I have them in the 7th spot. And this year, obviously, is going to be big for them. Drew Alar coming in here as a sophomore. He had a lot of good looks last year. He came into some games while they were up by a lot, and he was on that brink of being a red shirt last year, but he got in and they wanted to play him, especially when they're up in those big spots. And I think that's fine for him. He can come in this season, play, and then play next year too if he's looking to get drafted. And I do think he will. He was one of the best high school players overall, if not just the quarterback position coming out of his class. And like you said before, Nick Singleton, I think one of the best backs and hasn't been talked about enough. Last year as a freshman, absolutely insane. And him and Katron Allen, both of those guys being sophomores this year, and the running back class overall. I mean, they have some great depth in there too, but the wide receiver room is kind of where it's a little thin this year, especially coming off of last year with a lot of their wide receivers getting drafted or just getting picked up. But they are going to keep some players too. Alu Fashanu, obviously coming back, he would have been a top 10, if not a top 5 pick last year at the left tackle position. He's going to come in here and stay with a young-ish offensive line group, a lot of guys who are kind of sophomores, but there are a lot of depth in there in the offensive line area. I do think this team's going to be great this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they make a push. I've seen some people pushing for them for the playoffs, and I don't hate that overall. They're going to have to play Michigan. And if they can come out and beat Michigan, I think they definitely do have a potential to make the playoffs. At that point, if they beat Michigan or Ohio State, that's all they need to make the playoffs. If they go 11-1 and win one of those games, they can get in as that 4 spot. It just depends on how Drew Alar ends up coming into this season and playing. And I do think he'll be fine going into this season. He had a good offseason and built up, and the defense is great too. Obviously, we have guys like Chop Robinson and Kalen King, who I both think will get drafted last year. Both of them probably projected to be a first-round pick this year. I think Penn State's in for a good year this season, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get to the week where they play Ohio State or Michigan. If they can come out there and win that game, they're definitely looking for a playoff spot.
Yeah. And at 7, I want to talk about a team I know you're a little higher than me on, and that would be LSU. At the end of the day, if Jaden Daniels is fighting for the Heisman, then LSU is going to be dangerous no matter what. I know 7 is not a bad spot to put him. And Harold Perkins could emerge, and I think will emerge as one of the best defensive players in all of college football. We already saw flashes of that last year, but I think this year is a big prove it year for Perkins, especially. And like most SEC teams, they have some tough games. And I'm worried. I know Jaden Daniels has a lot of hype, but if he doesn't live up to that hype, they could take a skid. It's not a team that has, an easier schedule like some of the teams we've talked about in the past. They're not Washington, who has a Heisman level quarterback, but is going to get away with playing some easy competition, towards the start and the middle of their season. LSU has to play the LSU or the SEC schedule. They have probably an easier portion of it than most, but they're going to have some tough games. And I like Jaden Daniels a lot. I think he's going to be good. But if he isn't, like, this is a team that could take a major skid. And I don't think a lot of people in the media are talking about it as much as they should. It hurts me a little bit to put them over Tennessee. I think they're a lot closer to each other than a lot of people will say. I know you have LSU higher on this list. You're obviously going to explain why you have them in a spot where they would be making the playoffs. But I'll move on from that. LSU is a team that scares me a little bit, but I admit they're going to be pretty solid.
Yeah. And next up, in my 6th spot, I have Alabama. I'm a little lower on them than you. And a lot of people in the media, I would say, I'm not completely bought into them this season. My main question mark is obviously Jalen Milroe, who's going to start at quarterback for them. There is some good talent in the wide receiver room with Jermaine Burton and Isaiah Bond. And I'm a lot more impressed with the defense, especially with guys like Dallas Turner and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Both of those guys probably going to be first rounds. If not, they have the talent to be within the top 10 overall. My only issue with Alabama being very high this season is with teams like Ohio State and Michigan and even LSU within the SEC. It's going to be tough for them. And with Georgia still in the SEC, I don't see them winning the SEC championship. So I would give the edge, especially to a team like Ohio State or Michigan. Obviously, I think one of those teams will make the playoffs, winning whoever wins the Big Ten championship between those two. But I would probably give the edge to a team like Michigan over Alabama, especially with the strength of schedule and everything. If Michigan goes into the Big Ten championship and they only lose to Ohio State, then I would give them the edge. But Alabama, if Jalen Milroe comes out and plays very well, then obviously that's a different story. This defense is good enough to keep them as one of the best teams in the country. I'm just not completely bought in.
Yeah. And at 6, I have a team that you were a little lower on than I was. I have Clemson. I'm a believer in K Klubnik. I think he's actually a really solid quarterback. I know we haven't seen a lot from him, especially considering he was fighting with DJ when he was still there. DJ's off to Oregon State. They believe in Klubnik. And I think Garrett Riley should boost production on the offensive side. I think he's a great offensive mind in college football. Hopefully that pushes them to a higher level. But, admittedly, their defense is something that I think a lot of people are super bought in on. I still think there's some issues. I'm obviously moving on from Miles Murphy and Brian Persee for the NFL draft. They have guys to fill those spots, but let's not pretend like those guys weren't really solid contributors in college football. So we can't, act like it's a guarantee that they're going to have guys to fill those spots just as good as they were, especially a guy like Miles Murphy. As although I wasn't super high on him in NFL draft as a prospect, he was a super versatile defender at Clemson. So I think losing him is a bigger loss than some people will mention. That being said, I like the offense. I like the defense. There's a lot of things to like about Clemson this year. I think 6 is higher than most, but a pretty fair spot for him.
Next up, we both have USC in our 5th spot. So starting off, I just want to talk about them a little bit overall, and then I'll bounce it over to you. Having a guy and a quarterback as good as Caleb Williams automatically gives you a shot to make the playoffs. And we've seen so many teams with great receivers not be able to thrive, and they end up transferring because of it. But this USC team has high expectations because of who Williams is, and they should. They finished 12th last season and lost to Utah twice. But if they can figure out how to beat Utah this season, who is probably their biggest threat overall, especially within the conference, if they win out, they're definitely making the playoffs, even if they lose one game, but they still beat, I'm guessing, Utah at this point in the championship game. I'm giving a one loss or obviously a win out USC team a chance to make the playoffs overall. So the only way they don't make it is if they end up losing a game within the season and then losing again in the championship game. But I mean, with Caleb Williams, this team has the potential to win the national championship just because of how good he is. And this team overall outside of him is great too.
Yeah, and everyone knows this USC offense is electric. So I really just want to break down their schedule a little bit more. You mentioned you got to give a team that is built like this USC team that only has one loss or obviously undefeated a playoff spot. But it does get tough. I mean, outside of Utah, which will be probably their toughest matchup, they do have Notre Dame. They have Washington. They have Oregon. These are guys that play every year, but we were just talking about Washington and Oregon earlier. I mean, these are top tier teams that we both have ranked pretty highly. So in order for them to get a playoff spot, they're going to have to go either 4-0 or 3-1 in those games. And with that being said, I still think they're going to do it. It's not going to be easy, but when you have Caleb Williams under center, really anything is possible. I know it sounds like high praise, but we saw him last year. We've seen him, just his whole career, even since high school. He's poised. He really is just like the perfect quarterback prospect and the perfect guy you want leading this USC team. So I think 5 is a fair spot. Wouldn't be surprised if they make the playoffs at all, but it's going to be a really tough schedule. It's a tough path to get there for sure.
Yeah. And number 4, like you alluded to a little earlier, I have LSU. And like you said before, too, I think a lot of people aren't talking about how they could not be as great by the end of the year. I think this LSU team, out of every single team in college football this year, is the biggest boom or bust team this season. The offense with Jaden Daniels, they did lose some receivers, but they are going to have Malik Nabers, who is fantastic and arguably one of the best top 2 wide receivers in the draft this year. He's going to be great for them. And I do believe in Jaden Daniels overall. And if he can show flashes like we've seen before, this defense can pick up his slack if he struggles. Getting a healthy Mason Smith back is going to be huge. He was one of the best players in the country at one point, and now he's coming back off of the injury. If he can come back and play great again, I think he'll come back and be and show why he's one of the best defensive players overall in the country once again. And this LSU team just has great depth all around. I mean, when we look at the defensive line, when we look at the safeties, the cornerbacks, the wide receivers, it's really going to come down to if Jaden Daniels can go out there and produce. And I think he can. But like I said, this is a boom or bust team overall, especially competing in the SEC. It's going to be tough. But if they go in, if they win out and they play Georgia in the SEC championship with one loss, like we talked about with USC, it's going to be really tough not to put them in the playoffs. But it is going to be tough when LSU and Alabama face off.
Yeah. And in my fourth spot, I have Michigan. We all know the team is good. It's been good for a long time. And like most years, it's really going to depend on that last game against OSU. I expect Michigan to win all their games up until that point. Obviously, if you consider my rankings, I expect the same thing for Ohio State. And McCarthy is going to try to play himself into a first round selection. We've been talking about a lot of quarterbacks in this video, especially, we haven't seen a lot of these teams play yet. We're really excited to see what's going on in that quarterback position. I think McCarthy in particular has a lot to prove for himself. He's a guy that really didn't show up the way we wanted him to against TCU last year in the playoffs. And I think he's going to bounce back from that game with a fire in his gut. And I want to mention Harbaugh's self-imposed suspension. It won't change the course of their season. It's not. If he got a real suspension, he was penalized by the NCAA, maybe it would be an issue, but he's basically choosing how long he's going to sit out for. I don't think it's going to change Michigan's course of the season, especially because it's early in the season when they're not really playing anybody. This Wolverines team, they show up every year. They lose a lot of guys to the draft, but in the same way, they bring them in. So I think the Wolverines will compete in the Big Ten. And as long as they don't mess up along the way, as long as they get to that Ohio State game undefeated, I think they're pretty much a playoff lock.
Yeah, exactly what you said. I have them in my 3 spot right now. One thing that you didn't mention that I want to talk about, that they have probably the best running back duo that we've seen within the past few years. Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards, both Heisman candidates in their own right. I do think Blake Corum is probably the better of the two, but both of them, I don't want to take anything away from them because this team overall, if they just ran the ball every single play with both of those guys, they would be a top 15 team overall. But then you mix in everything else that they have, and they're one of the best teams in the country. I don't think they're as good as Ohio State right now, which might be a little bit of a hot take because there's a lot of people that have Michigan above them in their preseason rankings. But I do think that they're going to be right up there with them. That Ohio State and Michigan game, like it is every single season, is going to be huge. But I'm not as much of a believer in JJ McCarthy overall. He hasn't really shown me too much. But like you said, he's going to be fighting for that first round selection. But with that group overall on the defense that they have, it's going to be very tough for them not to make the playoffs this season, even if they end up losing to Ohio State in that matchup at the end of the year. A one-loss Michigan team is still going to make the playoffs.
Yeah, for sure. And at 3, I have Alabama, who you mentioned earlier. I have them right now in a playoff spot. I think Jalen Milroe obviously has a lot to prove, as you mentioned, but at the end of the day, Nick Saban will have his guys playing to the best of their abilities. And what I've seen from Milroe so far, I actually like quite a bit. Not to mention Dallas Turner is a guy who's going to dominate off the edge for this defense. And, just at the end of the day, they do have to play a lot of guys in the SEC. We say it with every SEC team we've talked about, but Alabama has been at the top of that conference for a while now. And I think we're going to see another year where Alabama almost dominates the competition. Obviously, as a Tennessee fan, that Tennessee game is going to be super important for them. But I don't know. I like what I've seen from Alabama up to this point, and there's a lot of question marks. I know they only announced their starting QB today, but I think Milroe was the correct decision, and I think Alabama will be fighting for a playoff spot come the end of the season.
And then next up, we both have the same top 2 at this point, if you guys have been following along. Obviously, Ohio State at 2 and Georgia at 1. Starting off with Ohio State, I think the biggest question is going to be with Kyle McCord. The rest of the team is filled out at every single position. 2 first-round receivers, 2 elite running backs, and a stacked defense overall. It's going to be very tough for this team to not succeed overall. But like I said, the biggest question mark will be at quarterback with Kyle McCord. But I think they'll figure it out. I think Ohio State, especially with their schedule too, they're going to have to play some teams in the Big Ten, but they're just going to be bumps in the road. I do think overall this team is going to be great, and they are one of the best teams in the country this year. And they have a plethora of players who are going to get drafted, if not within the first overall round this year. If you guys saw my top 25 going into this season, like I mentioned earlier, a good handful of them have been Ohio State players overall. I mean, we have guys on the defensive end, obviously both of their high-end wide receivers too. I just think this team is in for a very big year. And if it's ever going to be Ohio State's year, I think this is their year.
Yeah, and I completely agree because although Kyle McCord, I don't think is as good of a quarterback as I felt like CJ Stroud was. I think the roster built around McCord is better than we've seen from Ohio State in a long time. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. is probably the best player in college football. I wouldn't be surprised if he is in the Heisman race, even as a wide receiver. And on the defensive side, I really like Denzel Burke. I mean, he was a guy that was talked about a lot more a couple years ago as this guy that would make a big impact. Last year wasn't his. I think this year will be. They're going to have to beat Notre Dame on the road. That's a big game to point out, but they're at home for Penn State. They're at home for Michigan. And the whole roster that they put around McCord is just exceptional. Ohio State always produces a good team. I think Coach Day is going to have a lot in front of him if he loses that Michigan game again. That's obviously something that is a necessity to be a long-term coach at Ohio State. But I don't know. I think the roster is just too good to deny them a top 4 spot. Obviously, we have them both number 2. And I think the media is a little low on them because they're higher on Michigan. They think that's a guaranteed loss for Ohio State. I completely disagree. Wouldn't be surprised if at home the Buckeyes pull off a win and finally, beat Michigan, where it's felt like a long time since that's happened.
Yeah. And I completely agree with all that. And at number 1, we still have Georgia. I do think still the best team in the nation overall. There's a lot of people that I've seen. There is a lot of heat picking up for that Alabama to win the SEC. I don't think Georgia's losing another game this year. I think the only they'll have a test throughout the season. Obviously, the SEC championship will be a test. But I do think Ohio State's going to want that revenge in the playoffs. And I'm expecting a Georgia-Ohio State playoff championship game again. As we saw last year, I think Ohio State is going to try to come back and beat this team. But Georgia overall, if we're talking about some of the best players in college football, Brock Bowers is up there as one of the best offensive players I think I've watched personally in college football. And I know a lot of people think that he's very good, but I think this will be the season, especially going into his draft year, where people are really going to see how great of a tight end he is. Everyone was very high in the hype around Kyle Pitts a few years ago, but I think Brock Bowers is on another level. And saying that after Kyle Pitts got drafted with the 4th overall pick, and I know there's obviously a bunch of questions around him. I still think he's a great player in Atlanta. It's not his fault at this point. He hasn't had a real quarterback. But speaking about Georgia, I mean, from top to bottom, obviously they lose players. But like the same thing you said earlier with Ohio State and Michigan, you lose players, but you get them in at almost the same exact rate. This offensive line is still great. The cornerbacks, the only problem that I really see with this team overall is the running back position because of injuries. Branson Robinson was going to come in and be a great player this year for them, but he's going to be out with an injury. But even with that being said, I mean, we have Ra Thomas coming in from Mizzou. Brock Bowers is still there, Ladd McConkey. And this running back team, there are a lot of younger players, but they'll always figure it out too. And I think Georgia's going to come in and win the national championship again.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we've seen them. They haven't lost a game in 2 years. It's a team that's just absolutely incredible. And it's kind of wild to me how people want to put any other team above them right now, considering all the question marks we see on these other teams. Obviously, if you nitpick any team enough, you're going to find question marks. But in my research, at least, it was a lot harder to find something for Georgia. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. Even that running back room that, you pointed out as a question mark, I like what they're doing there, if I'm being honest. The receiving core, obviously, with Bowers and McConkey, that's a top tier level room, to be honest. I think a lot of people are going to point at Carson Beck at quarterback and say that they think he's going to be the reason that Georgia falls off. But if we can be honest, Denson Bennett was a really good quarterback, but it even felt like at times he didn't have to do too much. He was good, don't get me wrong, but it's not like he had to take on the role that a guy like Caleb Williams will have to, where he's, the whole stake of the team relies on his shoulders. Georgia's good enough to win a game and only put up 20 points or only throw the ball, 25 times. They just have so much talent in all their other positions. And just looking at their schedule, they don't really have a real test until mid-November when they have to travel to Knoxville to play the Volunteers. And even then, if Tennessee isn't finding their footing with Joe Milton at that point, then Georgia's probably just going to steamroll them. So the schedule looks like it's going to be in their favor. The team itself is just incredible. And I think a lot of people in the college football sphere would be lying if they didn't have Georgia at number one right now. The team's too good to deny. And I'm really probably not going to fall off on them much until they show me otherwise.
Yeah. And like you said, overall, same thing with Carson Beck that we've seen. Stetson Bennett, there were definitely spots where he showed potential of being a great player, and he came out there, especially in his later years, and he did that. But like you said, there was a lot of games where he just did what he needed to do and was a game manager. And Carson Beck needs to fill that role, and I think he can. This team has built obviously amazing with Kirby Smart there. The culture has completely shifted from where it was before, and I don't really see them losing a game. But overall, with our top 25, this will probably be the longest video, like I mentioned at the beginning. Each episode, we're probably just going to talk about some risers, some fallers, everything that happened throughout the week. But these are just our initial reactions and predictions for the season overall.
Yeah, and we're happy to get this list out. It's something fun. We didn't get to do it last year, but obviously we're big fans of college football. Start of the season, it might just be a lot of fluff that we're talking about right now. We haven't actually seen the teams play, but week to week, we're going to actually get a look at these squads, see what they're doing, and mentioning the risers and fallers are going to be fun. There's obviously a couple teams on this list that won't be here maybe when we're talking next week. So it's going to be a fun year. It's one of the most uncertain years of college football since I've been following. Who knows what's going to happen with Georgia? Obviously, we're both high on them. They could, this could be the year they finally lose a game. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one.
Yeah, and we'll see you guys next week to talk about it.
See you guys.